Story number 1. The Echoes of Cropsey. It wasn't until the third child vanished that the whispers started. They came quietly at first, just murmurs among the mothers who met at the grocery store, and hushed conversations in the church pews. But soon, the town couldn't ignore it any longer. 3 kids, all in the same week. All from the same quiet neighborhood that used to be safe. The first was Sophie, 8 years old. Her mother said she'd gone out to play on a Saturday afternoon, and by dinner she was gone. No screaming, no sign of a struggle, just gone. Then came Mason, 10, who disappeared on a walk to the park. The boy's bicycle was found in the woods, its wheels still spinning, the smell of pine and damp earth clinging to it. Finally, there was Emily, 11, and the one everyone thought was too old to be snatched. But Emily, too, was gone, her shoes left neatly by the front door, as if she'd simply stepped out and forgotten them. It didn't take long for people to start talking about Cropsey. You see, Cropsey was a name that had lingered in the dark corners of the town for as long as anyone could remember. A name from the old stories the parents told their children to keep them inside after dark. The figure of Cropsey was never clear. Some said he was a man who lived in the woods, a loner, someone whose face had been scarred by fire. Others said he was something worse, something older, a shadow that hunted children. Every generation had its own version of the tale, but the core of it remained the same. Cropsey was the thing that came when children wandered too far, when they strayed from the safety of their homes. And now, with the children missing, Cropsey was real. The town had a new suspect, a man named Frank. Frank was harmless, or so everyone thought. A grizzled, quiet man who kept to himself, his house a shack at the edge of the woods. He'd been the subject of rumors for years. Some said he was a recluse, some said he was a drunk. But no one ever suspected him of anything violent until now. The police found his shack empty, the door ajar, the floor littered with old magazines and empty bottles. But in the back, behind the wood stove, they found something strange. Deep gouges in the floorboards. No one could explain them, but they were there. Deep, jagged, like something heavy had dragged itself across the floor, leaving scars behind. A few days later, Frank showed up at the town diner, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. He was shaking, his eyes wild. He sat at the counter ordering coffee, but when he spoke, his words were slurred and broken. "They're here, the kids, they're still here." People laughed, thinking he was just another drunk rambling. But Frank's eyes were wide with fear, his hands trembling as if they'd seen something no one should ever see. "They never leave," he whispered. "Not really. Cropsey, he doesn't take them, he just keeps them." The sheriff took Frank in for questioning, but the man didn't make any sense. He kept mumbling about things he'd seen in the woods, about eyes watching him in the dark, about whispers in the night. The sheriff dismissed it as madness. But in the back of his mind, something was wrong. It wasn't long before they found the kids. Sophie, Mason, Emily. They were alive, but barely. They were hidden deep in the woods, just beyond the tree line where no one dared go. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. They couldn't speak, couldn't explain what had happened to them. It was as if they had been taken and then returned, changed. That night, the town was filled with unease. The woods were alive with the sound of things moving in the dark. The wind howled like something in pain, and somewhere in the distance a child's laughter echoed. Cropsey hadn't just taken the children, he had left his mark on them. And now, it seemed, he was claiming them again. The sheriff drove out to the woods, hoping to find answers, hoping to prove there was some logical explanation for the disappearances. But as he ventured deeper into the trees, he felt it. Something watching him from the shadows. Something that didn't belong. And that was when he saw it. A figure, tall and twisted, moving silently through the trees. Its face was obscured, but the outline of it, a head too large for the body, a mouth that stretched unnaturally wide, sent chills down his spine. The sheriff rose. His breath hitched. "Cropsey," he whispered, but the words felt wrong coming from his mouth. The figure didn't approach, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. And as the sheriff's heart pounded in his chest, the figure began to move again, fading into the woods like a shadow slipping through the cracks of reality. And then the whispers came. They came from everywhere. From the trees, from the ground, from the very air itself. It was a voice, low, guttural, like something that had not spoken for centuries. "You can't stop it," the voice said. "You never could." The sheriff didn't know if he was hearing the voice of the man, or something much older, much darker. But he did know one thing. Cropsey was no longer a story. He was a living nightmare. When the sheriff came back to the town, he didn't speak. He couldn't. He tried to explain what he'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. And when the town looked at him, they saw something in his eyes. A flicker of terror, of knowing something they couldn't understand. It was too late. The children weren't just victims, they were the messengers. They had been taken, marked, and brought back to spread the curse of Cropsey. As the days passed, the whispers grew louder. People began to disappear, one by one. Some vanished without a trace, while others were found, their faces twisted in terror, their bodies marked by something that looked like claw marks. The town was unraveling, its sanity slowly eroding as Cropsey's presence grew stronger. And all the while, the children, Sophie, Mason, Emily, watched from the shadows, silent, their eyes reflecting the blood-stained legacy of a past they couldn't escape. The lines between predator and prey had blurred. The town was no longer a place of refuge. It was a hunting ground. And Cropsey, he was just getting started. Story number 2. The last summer. It was supposed to be a fun night, just a group of kids looking for something to thrill them. The kind of thing that made the summer feel alive. They'd all heard the stories, the old rumors about the abandoned asylum at the edge of town, where Cropsey, the so-called boogeyman, had once lived. It was a place the parents warned them to stay away from, but that was exactly why they wanted to go. They were 16, invincible, and bored out of their minds. "Who's up for it?" Brad, the ringleader, asked. He was the first one to suggest it, and the first one to act like he wasn't scared. The others, Cassie, Matt, and Tony, didn't need much convincing. They'd all heard the stories too, how Cropsey had been locked away in the asylum, how he'd once been a patient, how he'd vanished after a bloody escape. But no one really believed it. They arrived just after sunset, the asylum's broken silhouette rising like a ghost from the overgrown woods. The windows were shattered, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. The wind had kicked up, swirling the dust and leaves around their feet as they stood there, the air suddenly thick with tension. "This place is a dump," Tony said, grinning as he pushed past the others and stepped inside. His voice echoed in the hollow, empty halls. Cassie hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone, or something, to be watching them from the darkness. But no one said anything. They'd all heard the stories, but none of them thought they were real. Not until they walked inside. The air was stale, the walls damp, and the floor creaked under their feet. The asylum's halls were long and winding, like a maze that had been left to rot. The sound of their footsteps was the only thing that filled the space, until the first door slammed shut behind them. They froze. Matt turned, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" But when they looked back, The door was just shut. No sign of anyone. "Just the wind," Brad said, though there was an edge to his voice now. His cocky demeanor was starting to crack. They kept walking, their breaths quickening with every step. The further they went, the more oppressive the air became. Every time they turned a corner, it felt like something was just out of sight, waiting for them. Then came the footsteps. At first, they thought it was one of them, messing around, trying to scare the others. But no one was behind them. And the footsteps, heavy, dragging, deliberate, were closer than they'd expected. "Guys," Cassie's voice shook. "Did you hear that?" They stopped. The sound of dragging feet came from down the hall, faint but unmistakable. It was like something, or someone, was following them. "What the hell is going on?" Tony muttered, his bravado crumbling. "This isn't funny anymore." Brad was already moving, his voice tight. "We need to get out of here." But just as they turned to leave, the door at the end of the hall slammed open with a deafening bang. A dark shape stood there, too tall, too wide to be human. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood, watching them with eyes that were not human. "Cropsey," Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure took a step forward, its footsteps hollow, echoing down the hall. It was tall, its face obscured by shadows, but the eyes, they glowed. Not from light, but from something darker, something hungry. And then they realized this wasn't a story. Cropsey was real, and he was waiting for them. Panic hit like a tidal wave. The kids bolted, running down the hallway, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could hear the dragging footsteps behind them, getting louder, closer. It was as if the air itself had turned against them, the walls pressing in, the shadows stretching out like fingers trying to grab them. Cassie tripped, her knee slamming into the floor. Tony pulled her up, but in the process they lost track of the others. "Brad! Matt!" Cassie screamed, but the only answer was the relentless sound of those footsteps, dragging, following, getting closer. They reached the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the asylum had decided they weren't leaving. Brad and Matt were nowhere in sight, and there was only the echo of their own breaths and the sound of something heavy, shifting behind them. "We can't get out," Tony said, panic rising in his voice. "We're trapped." And then the door creaked open, slowly, painfully, as if something inside was letting them go, but not without a price. They ran into the night, stumbling out into the woods, not daring to look back. They didn't stop running until they were at the edge of town, gasping for air, their bodies trembling. But even then, they knew. They had left something behind. Something that was still in the asylum, waiting for anyone else foolish enough to come. They tried to warn people. They tried to tell them what happened, but no one believed them. Cropsey wasn't just a story, and he wasn't just waiting in the asylum. He was out there, in the woods, in the dark, always hunting, always waiting. And that night, the last summer night, they realized they were the lucky ones. Because the ones who didn't make it, they would never be seen again. And Cropsey, he never stopped hunting. Story number 3. The Forgotten Ones. Toby had never been the kid anyone noticed. He was the one who sat alone at lunch, the one no one bothered to look at when the teacher asked for volunteers. At home, things weren't much better. His father had left when he was just a baby, and his mother, when she wasn't drinking, was too lost in her own world to care about him. He was an afterthought, a shadow in the corner of a house that barely felt like a home. Most of the time, Toby kept to himself. He wandered the streets, scrounging for food, hiding in places where no one could find him. He wasn't sure when he had started hearing the stories, but he knew they had to be true. Kids like him, forgotten, abandoned, left behind, didn't have a chance against Cropsey. Cropsey was a name that had drifted through the small town for as long as Toby could remember. An old tale, really, something parents used to scare their kids into behaving. But now, it wasn't just a story to Toby. It was a warning that the world would cast you aside, and when it did, Cropsey would come for you. He'd heard it from other kids on the streets, the ones who had nowhere to go, the ones who knew what it was like to be invisible. They spoke of Cropsey like they knew him, like they'd seen him. They said he was always watching, waiting for the forgotten ones, the kids who had been abandoned by the world. And when he took you, you never came back. Toby didn't know why the stories haunted him so much. Maybe it was because, deep down, he knew they were meant for him. Maybe it was because the idea of being taken by something, anything, seemed like it would be a relief. Anything was better than this life of being ignored. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a sickly shade of orange, Toby found himself wandering farther than usual, deeper into the woods that bordered the town. His mind wandered, as it often did, to the old tales of Cropsey. They felt closer now, the rumors sharper, the warning clearer. And with each step he took, the feeling of being watched grew heavier, like a weight on his chest. It wasn't long before he came across something strange. An old shack tucked away behind the trees, half hidden by the overgrown brush. It looked abandoned, the wood rotting, the roof caved in from years of neglect. It wasn't much of a shack, just a collection of broken boards and shattered windows. But something about it felt wrong. There was a stillness in the air, an unnatural quiet that made Toby's skin crawl. He stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do. He knew he should turn around, go back home before it got dark, but something pulled him toward it. Maybe it was the curiosity, the need to find out if the stories were true. Maybe it was just the loneliness, the desperate hope that someone, or something, would notice him for once. Toby pushed open the door, and it creaked loudly, as if protesting his intrusion. The inside of the shack was just as run down as the outside, with dust and debris covering the floor, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. But there was something else too, a faint, foul odor, like something that had been left to rot for far too long. As Toby stepped inside, he felt it. A coldness in the air, a chill that seemed to seep into his bones. He looked around, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. In the far corner of the room, there was a small bed, its frame rusted and the mattress torn. But it wasn't the bed that caught his attention. It was the figure sitting at the edge of it. The man, or whatever it was hunched over, his face obscured by a hood. His clothes were tattered, his hands clawed and twisted. Toby's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he thought about turning and running. But something held him there, rooted to the spot, as if his legs no longer belonged to him. "You're here," the figure rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping together. "You've finally come." Toby's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say, what to do. He wanted to run, to scream, but the words wouldn't come. And then the figure lifted its head, revealing its face. It was nothing like what Toby had imagined. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over bones that looked too sharp, too unnatural. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark and empty, hollow sockets that seemed to stare right through him. And its mouth was twisted into a grin, too wide, too jagged, like something that wasn't meant to smile. "You've been forgotten," the thing whispered. "But I never forget. I take the ones who are left behind, the ones who don't belong, and you, Toby, you don't belong." The words sank into him, like a blade in his gut. He knew, deep down, that Cropsey wasn't just a story. He wasn't some myth to scare kids into behaving. He was real. And Toby had just walked right into his grasp. The figure stood, its movement slow and deliberate, its body bending in unnatural angles. Toby tried to move, tried to run, but his legs felt like lead. The room was spinning, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, closing in on him. "You can't escape me," Cropsey's voice echoed in his head. "No one ever does." Toby felt a cold hand on his shoulder, a grip that was like ice. And in that moment, as the darkness closed in around him, he realized something horrifying. He wasn't the one who had been forgotten. He had been chosen. And there was no escape. As the last remnants of the sunlight disappeared, so did Toby. He became another name in the stories. Another child who had been taken by the thing that waited for the lost, the neglected, and the forgotten. And Cropsey? He was always waiting for the next one. Story number 4. The Return of Cropsey. It had been years since anyone had mentioned Cropsey. The stories had died down, faded into the past like so many other small-town legends. People forgot about the old campgrounds, the horrific things that happened there. After Cropsey's supposed death, the town moved on. They had to. But when Sheriff Tom Hawkins got the call late one night, he knew. The familiar feeling of dread hit him before he even stepped out of bed. "Another one," the dispatcher's voice crackled over the line. "Body found near the old campsite. Looks bad, real bad." He knew exactly where she meant. The campgrounds had been abandoned for years, the place left to rot after Cropsey was supposedly killed. But now? Now it was a killing ground again. The body was barely recognizable, blood staining the dirt around it. The stench of decay hung in the air, a sickly sweetness that made Tom's stomach turn. The victim, an adult this time, was disfigured, limbs twisted unnaturally, and the face, it wasn't just dead, it was punished. The skin was sliced open, almost ritualistic, as if whoever did it wanted to leave something behind. Tom had been around long enough to know the signs. He had seen what Cropsey's handiwork looked like, even back when the man, or whatever he was, had been alive. He had told himself Cropsey was dead, that he was nothing but a story. But here they were, staring at the evidence that said otherwise. The body wasn't the first. More had turned up in the past few days, scattered around the woods like discarded trash. Each one had been left with the same grotesque markings, the same brutal treatment. It was as if Cropsey was picking up where he left off, and now no one was safe. The sheriff stood over the body, staring down at the mangled corpse, feeling something stir inside of him. Something dark. Something he hadn't thought about in years. Guilt. He had been there. He had been complicit in the evil that had happened in this town. When Cropsey had been alive, it was the sheriff. Young, eager, full of pride, who had led the search for the man. But they never found him. They never found Cropsey. Tom had always told himself they did the right thing, that the man had vanished into the woods, that he had gotten what was coming to him. But deep down, he knew the truth. They hadn't stopped him. They had let him go, turned a blind eye when they should have looked harder. And now, Cropsey was back. And he wasn't just killing kids anymore. He was hunting everyone who had been complicit in the evil. Everyone who had ignored the truth. Tom walked away from the scene, his mind racing. He tried to push away the guilt, tried to convince himself that this wasn't his fault. But the memories kept coming back. The stories of the children who had gone missing, the things they had never said aloud, the whispered rumors about the campgrounds. They all led back to the same place, the place where Cropsey had once lived. The sheriff's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He answered without thinking. "Sheriff Hawkins?" a voice said on the other end. It was his deputy, and there was panic in his voice. "I've got another one," the deputy said. "Found at the edge of the woods, by the old fire pit. It's another one of us, Sheriff, one of the town's own." Tom's heart sank. It was happening again. The killings weren't random, they were personal. Cropsey wasn't just hunting. He was making a statement. As Tom made his way back to the office, the reality of it all began to hit him. He knew he couldn't just ignore this anymore. Cropsey had returned, and this time there was no running, no hiding. The town was going to burn for the sins of its past, and it was all going to start with him. The sheriff began his investigation, but the more he dug, the more he realized Cropsey wasn't after just anyone. The people who were dying, who had been marked, were all tied to the town's dark history, to the things that had happened when Cropsey was alive. The ones who had covered up the abuse, the neglect. The ones who had let him slip away and vanish into the woods. Each death felt like a personal punishment, as if Cropsey was coming for the ones who had wronged him, coming for the ones who had let his legacy live on in silence. Tom couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Each body that turned up, each mutilated victim, felt like a reflection of his own guilt. He couldn't escape it anymore. And as the bodies piled up, as the town turned into a war zone of fear and whispers, he knew one thing. Cropsey wasn't finished. Not yet. Tom sat alone in his office that night, the fluorescent lights buzzing above him. He had no answers, only questions, and a feeling deep in his gut that told him he wouldn't get out of this one. Because Cropsey was back, and this time the sheriff was just as much a part of the nightmare as the rest of them. The blood that was spilled, Tom could feel it on his hands, and it was only a matter of time before Cropsey came for him too. As the town slipped deeper into panic, as the killings continued, Tom realized he couldn't stop it. The past had come back to claim them all, and this time, Cropsey wasn't just a man. He was a force, a dark, vengeful presence that had come to right the wrongs of a town that had turned its back on its own sins. The sheriff couldn't escape the truth, and neither could the town. Story number 5. The Unseen Hands. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away, a getaway to the countryside to escape the noise of city life. Alex, Rachel, Mike, and Jenna had been friends since college, and this weekend was their chance to reconnect, relax, and forget about their jobs and all the stress that came with them. They rented an old, secluded farmhouse about an hour outside of town, tucked away in the woods, far from any civilization. The place had its charm. Creaky wooden floors, a fireplace that crackled with warmth, and big windows that looked out over rolling hills and dense forest. But there was something about it that felt off. It wasn't anything anyone could put their finger on, but it was there. A heaviness in the air, a feeling that someone was watching them. The first night, they drank wine and told old stories around the fire. Jenna brought up the local legend of Cropsey, the boogeyman who supposedly lived in the woods years ago. They say he was locked up in the old sanitarium before they shut it down, she said, her voice playful but nervous. Kids used to tell stories about him, how he'd take anyone who wandered too far into the woods. Alex laughed. You really believe that crap? Cropsey's just a story, like all the other ghost stories people tell to scare you. Rachel chuckled, but she looked over at the dark line of trees that stretched beyond the yard. Still, it's creepy out here. I wouldn't be surprised if Cropsey's just a cover for something that really happened in that old sanitarium. Mike leaned back in his chair, a little tipsy. If you're so worried about Cropsey, maybe we should go check out the sanitarium tomorrow. I mean, it's just a few miles down the road, right? That was all it took. The next morning, they decided to make the trip. The sanitarium was just as abandoned as they'd been told. Its crumbling brick walls overrun with ivy, windows boarded up, and the faintest smell of decay in the air. The place had been deserted for decades, but rumors still clung to it like the damp moss growing on its exterior. As they walked around the grounds, taking pictures and joking about the creepy vibe, something caught Alex's eye. A faint outline of a door in the back of the building that wasn't completely boarded up. Curiosity got the better of him. "Hey, look over here," he said, pointing. "There's a way in." The group hesitated but eventually followed Alex. They pushed open the door with a loud groan, stepping into a dim hallway that smelled of mildew and rot. Old papers and broken furniture littered the floor, and the walls were marked with strange symbols, smeared, like someone had dragged their fingers through the dust and grime. "God, this place is disgusting," Rachel said, her voice tight with unease. Mike snickered. "It's just an old sanitarium, Rachel. What did you expect?" But the atmosphere was different now, thicker somehow. The further they ventured into the building, the more uncomfortable they felt. They heard things, scratching noises coming from the walls, a faint whisper in the distance. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but it didn't feel like wind. It felt like something else, something alive. They stumbled upon a room that looked like it had once been an office, with a rotting desk and papers scattered all over the floor. But the strangest thing was the wall. A large section had been scratched away, like something had clawed at it from the inside. "What the hell is this?" Jenna asked, her voice low. She stepped closer, brushing the dirt from the wall, revealing more of the marks, deep, jagged lines, like fingernails had torn through the plaster. "Probably just kids messing around," Alex said, but even he didn't sound convinced. And then it happened. A loud bang from upstairs. It was so sudden it made them all jump. They froze, listening as the noise echoed through the building, followed by a soft scraping sound. Something, or someone, was moving around up there. "We need to leave," Rachel whispered, but none of them moved. They stood in the silence, hearts racing, waiting. But then, slowly, Mike started walking toward the stairs. "It's probably just an animal or something. Let's check it out." None of them wanted to follow, but they did. They crept up the stairs, the old wood creaking under their feet. When they reached the top, they found an empty hallway, except for one thing. The door at the end of the hall was wide open, revealing a small room that had once been a patient's quarters. The walls in here were covered with more of the strange symbols, but now they were fresh, recently scratched, as if someone had done it just hours ago. In the corner of the room, on the floor, was a pile of old clothes, and underneath the clothes, something that made Alex's stomach lurch. It was a hand. Not a human hand, but something much worse. Twisted, distorted, and smeared in dark red. It seemed to twitch ever so slightly before slowly curling back into the shadows. "What the hell?" Mike whispered, backing away. And then the whispers started. Soft at first, but growing louder, closer, until it sounded like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. The air in the room grew colder, and a heavy pressure filled the space. Jenna's eyes widened in terror. "We need to get out, now!" But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening crack. The room plunged into darkness, the whispers now surrounding them. Alex felt a coldness on his neck, a breath he couldn't explain, and then a heavy hand, too many hands, gripping his shoulder, pulling him back. He screamed, but the sound was muffled, drowned out by the others. They were all trapped, struggling against unseen forces, their limbs pulled in every direction. It was as if the sanitarium itself was alive, reaching out, dragging them into its depths. And then the whispers stopped. The hands loosened. The group stood frozen in the pitch-black room, hearts racing. The door creaked open, slowly, with a sinister groan. Alex's voice shook as he gasped, "We need to leave. We can't stay here." They ran, but they couldn't outrun the feeling. The thing that had been waiting in that building, in those walls, Cropsey, wasn't just a story. It was real, and it had found them. By the time they made it back to the farmhouse, shaken and covered in dirt, they couldn't speak. They had tried to leave it all behind, but the memory of those unseen hands would follow them forever. No one would ever know what really happened at that sanitarium, or what they'd uncovered. But the walls knew. The walls always knew. Story number 6. The Witness. Lucy had always been a quiet child, the kind of girl who spent more time in the woods than in the company of other kids. The trees were her friends, the wind, her comfort. She'd wander for hours, collecting rocks, sticks, and small treasures she found on the forest floor. But that day, the day she came back, she was different. She was quiet, yes, but it was more than that. It was the silence of someone who had seen something they couldn't unsee. It was late afternoon when she returned to town, her clothes torn, her skin scratched and dirty, her eyes wide and haunted. Her mother, frantic with worry, found her standing at the edge of the woods, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. Lucy wouldn't speak. She wouldn't tell anyone what had happened. Not her mother, not the police, not even the friends who came to see if she was okay. She just stared at the woods, her face pale, her lips trembling. They tried to get answers, but Lucy wouldn't say a word. It was as though something inside her had snapped, and whatever terror she'd faced out there had stolen her voice. It wasn't until days later that her mother, desperate and confused, called the sheriff. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "Lucy's she's not right. She won't talk about it. She just sits there, staring." The sheriff came, took one look at the girl's ashen face, and shook his head. "She's just scared," he said. "She'll be fine in time." But Lucy didn't get better. She grew worse. She stopped eating, stopped playing, stopped living. Her eyes were fixed on the same patch of woods every day. It was like she was waiting for something to come out of the trees and drag her back into the darkness. The townspeople didn't know what to make of it. Some whispered that she'd seen a wild animal, maybe a bear, maybe something worse. Others suggested she'd just lost her mind. But Lucy's silence, the way she looked at the woods like they were alive, made them uneasy. Then the animals started turning up. At first, it was just a few dead squirrels, their bodies torn apart, their insides spilling out onto the forest floor. It was disturbing, but no one thought much of it. A raccoon or a coyote, maybe. But then, the dogs started disappearing. One by one, the pets of the town went missing. Some were found mutilated beyond recognition, others just gone. No blood, no trace. The sheriff dismissed it as animal attacks, wild creatures from the woods. But there was something off about it. It didn't feel right. No animal, not even the wildest of predators, left bodies like that. The woods had always been there, a silent presence at the edge of town. But now, they felt different. The trees seemed darker. The air felt thicker, pressing in on you as you walked through it. The whole town began to notice it. The way the shadows seemed deeper, the way the silence felt too heavy, as though the woods were watching. Lucy's silence became unbearable. People whispered behind her back, accusing her of hiding something, of knowing something that no one else did, but when they asked, she wouldn't answer. Not with words anyway, she would just look at them, her eyes wide and terrified, her face drained of color. And when they pushed harder, when they demanded answers, the terror in her eyes deepened. The sheriff tried to get to the truth. He brought Lucy to his office, sat her down and asked her what happened in the woods, but she wouldn't speak. Instead, she reached into her pocket, her fingers trembling, and pulled out something small, something dark and slick with blood. It was a piece of a doll, its face twisted in a grotesque grimace. That's from the woods," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's not just an old story." The sheriff's face went pale. He had heard the stories, the old ones, the ones about Cropsey, the man who lived in the woods who took children and left them broken. But those were just stories, the kind of things mothers told their kids to keep them close to home. Only now, it felt real. The next night, the town was rocked by a scream. A woman found her husband's body in the yard, mangled beyond recognition. The sheriff knew, even before he saw it, that it wasn't an animal. No wild animal did this. This was something else. Something far worse. The town was on edge. People began to lock their doors at night, keep their children close. But it was too late. The fear had already taken root. And Lucy was the only one who knew. She was the witness to whatever had come out of those woods. As the days went by, more bodies were found, and each one was more brutal than the last. The sheriff couldn't ignore it anymore. He couldn't pretend it was just an animal. The mutilations, the blood, the way the victims had been positioned, it was all too deliberate. One night, when the sheriff finally confronted Lucy's mother, he found her sitting in the dark, clutching her daughter. "I've seen him," Lucy whispered, her voice breaking. "He's out there, he's waiting. Cropsey, he never left." The sheriff felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He'd heard the name before, in stories told by old-timers, but it had always been dismissed as just that, stories. Now, it was real. It was out there in the woods, and it was coming for them all. The line between reality and madness was starting to blur. The sheriff didn't know what was real anymore. The things Lucy had seen, the things the townspeople whispered about. It was all beginning to merge into something too terrible to comprehend. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon that evening, the woods seemed to grow darker, the air thicker, and the whispers closer. Cropsey was out there, and no one was safe. Story number 7. The Children of the Forest. The camp was supposed to be the answer, a place to turn around the lives of troubled teens, to offer them a second chance. The director, Frank Wheeler, had run the place for 5 years, watching kids come and go, each one with a different story. Some had been caught up in drugs, others in violence, all of them running from something. Frank told himself every year that this would be the one. This would be the year the kids would finally turn a corner, the year they'd get it together. But this summer, something was different. Something was wrong. It started with Jacob. He was one of the newer kids, a quiet boy who barely spoke, but carried a lot of anger in his eyes. Frank had hoped the isolation of the camp would do him some good, get him away from the bad influences in the city, give him some space to think. Jacob had been out for a hike with 2 of the camp's counselors. By the time they came back, Jacob was gone. His counselors swore they hadn't seen him disappear. One minute he was there, the next he was gone, swallowed up by the woods. They searched for hours, but there was no sign of him. The next day, a search party went out. No Jacob, nothing. Frank tried to keep the other kids calm. He probably ran off, he said, but even he wasn't convinced. The woods around the camp were thick, dense, and wild. No one ran off into those woods and just disappeared. And Frank knew it. But the staff didn't question it. Not at first. The disappearances started happening every few days after that. First Jacob, then Kelly, the girl with the mouth that never stopped talking. And then Kyle, who had been sent to camp for breaking into houses. One by one they vanished, always at night, always without a sound. At first, Frank chalked it up to kids running away, trying to escape. But the more it happened, the more he began to doubt his own logic. The children weren't just running, they were being taken. And there was something in the woods that was taking them, something ancient. The staff was terrified, but Frank couldn't afford to show it. He had a reputation to uphold. He was the one the kids turned to when they felt lost, the one they trusted when they needed guidance. But now, the trust was slipping away. The kids weren't afraid of the woods. They were terrified of the camp itself. They spoke in whispers about Cropsey, the boogeyman of local legend. Frank didn't believe in ghosts or myths or curses, but the unease was real, and it gnawed at him, just as it gnawed at the kids who had come to this place for help. There was something in the air, something suffocating, making it harder to breathe. The more Frank ignored it, the worse it became. The cabins felt smaller, the trees seemed darker, the wind colder, and the whispers, they never stopped. By the time it was the fifth child, Frank knew what had to be done. He had heard the rumors, the old stories, about Cropsey, how he had taken children, how he haunted the woods just outside the camp. It was the kind of thing the locals whispered about, a warning for their kids to stay close at night, to never venture into the woods. It was a legend, a myth that had been passed down for generations. But now, Frank wasn't so sure it was just a story. He went to the camp's oldest counselor, Sam, who had worked at the camp long before Frank had taken over. Sam was a local, a man who had grown up hearing the stories about Cropsey. Sam didn't look Frank in the eye when he spoke. "You can't stop it," he said quietly, his voice shaking. "It's in the woods. You can't fight it." "Cropsey?" Frank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sam nodded. "Yeah, he was real, and he's been waiting." It was the first time Frank had ever seen fear in Sam's eyes. And it wasn't fear of the kids, or the woods, or the isolation. It was something older, something darker. Frank didn't know what to believe. But what he did know was this: the camp was no longer a safe place. The children who came here were vanishing, and no one was telling him why. Late that night, Frank set out alone into the woods. He didn't know what he expected to find. He wasn't sure if he believed in the stories, or if he just wanted to prove they were wrong. But he walked deeper and deeper into the woods, past the old boundary that he had warned the kids never to cross. As he pushed through the underbrush, the woods grew quieter, too quiet. And then he saw it. An old cabin, half rotted, hidden deep in the trees. It wasn't on the map. It wasn't a place the kids were supposed to go. He walked up to it, his heart pounding in his chest. The door was ajar, hanging crooked on rusted hinges. He stepped inside, and the smell hit him, damp, decayed, like something had been rotting for years. The place was abandoned, or so he thought. But when Frank turned, he saw the wall. It was covered in old red marks. Scratches, gouges, symbols he didn't understand. And there, in the corner of the room, was a pile of old bones. Children's bones. He stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. And then he heard it, scratching at the door, tapping on the windows, something just outside the cabin. He turned to run, but the door slammed shut on its own. The walls creaked. The shadows in the corners seemed to move. And then, through the floorboards, he saw it. A hand, pale and twisted, reaching up toward him from beneath the cabin. He tried to scream, but no sound came. In that moment, Frank understood. Cropsey had never left. He had only been waiting for the right time to come back. And now, the camp, his camp, was part of the curse. The children had become the prey, and Frank was the last one left to face the consequences of his own failure. The camp had become a place of terror, and there was no escape, story Number 8. The Marks of Cropsey. Jonah hadn't been back to the old house in years. Not since he'd left for college, then moved out of state, then across the country. He didn't want to come back. Not after everything, not after what happened. But his father was dead now, and the house had been left to him. His father's wishes, written in a will that Jonah hadn't cared to read until now. So, after all the years, Jonah found himself standing in front of the place he'd run away from. The house was still the same, though it had aged poorly, with peeling paint and cracks in the windows. The overgrown yard seemed to swallow the place whole, but the bones of the house were still there, the foundation still intact, as if waiting for him to come back. He stepped inside, the creaking of the door loud in the empty house. Dust and stale air hit him immediately. It felt dead. The memories of his childhood, the good and the bad, rushed at him like a tidal wave. But there was one memory that always stood out more than the others. The day his sister, Emily, disappeared. She had been only 8 years old, just a few years younger than him, but so full of life. That was the thing about Emily. She had always been so full of life. Until she wasn't. She had just vanished one summer night right from their backyard without a trace. Jonah had searched, his parents had searched, but the woods behind their house had kept its secrets. The police came, but they never found anything. After a while, the search stopped and people stopped asking questions. It was just one of those things. It was as if Emily had never existed. Jonah's parents didn't talk about her anymore. They didn't want to. It was easier that way. But now, standing in the house, all those memories he had buried deep in his mind began to surface. And with them came something darker, something he wasn't ready to face. The memories felt like flashes at first. Emily's laugh, her smile, the way she would run through the yard, always asking him to follow her into the woods. He remembered the stories they used to tell each other at night, about Cropsey, the thing that lived in the woods. It was a story their parents had told them, the kind of tale designed to scare them into staying close to home. Cropsey would take you if you weren't careful, they said. He'd come out of the woods and take you away, never to be seen again. Jonah had always thought it was just a story, just something to make them behave. But as the years had passed, as Emily had disappeared, he began to wonder. Could it have been real? Could Cropsey have been real? Jonah walked deeper into the house, his footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. He hadn't been in the attic in years, but something drew him there now, a feeling he couldn't shake. The old wooden stairs creaked under his weight as he made his way up. The attic door was slightly ajar, as though waiting for him. Inside, it was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of old books and forgotten things. Jonah's eyes fell on a small chest in the corner of the room. It was the one thing in the attic that had never been moved, never touched. He had seen it 100 times before when he was a child, but his parents had always told him not to open it. He reached for the chest now, his hands trembling. The lock was rusted, but it gave way easily. Inside, there was a collection of old things. Photographs, faded toys, and a bundle of yellowed papers. But as he sifted through the items, something caught his eye. A small, tattered notebook. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the handwriting. It was his father's, but the words were strange, hurried, like they were written in fear. He opened the notebook and began to read. Cropsey is not just a story, he is real. We made a deal with him. I never wanted to do it, but it had to be done. Emily, we should never have let her go into the woods. She was the price. The words hit Jonah like a punch to the gut. His eyes flew to the next page, desperate to understand. I'm sorry, Jonah. I thought I could keep you safe. I thought I could protect you from the truth. But the truth is, Cropsey has claimed her. and now he's coming for the rest of us. He never forgets, he never forgives. Jonah's blood ran cold as the meaning of the words sank in. Cropsey hadn't just been a story, he had been real. And his sister's disappearance, it wasn't just some random tragedy, it was part of something much darker, something tied to his own family. His father had made a deal with Cropsey, a deal that had cost Emily her life. Jonah dropped the notebook, his mind racing. He couldn't breathe. He had to get out of this house. He had to leave. But as he turned to run, the door to the attic slammed shut, trapping him inside. Panic rose in his chest as he pounded on the door, but the room grew colder. He felt a presence behind him, something in the shadows, something that wasn't there before. A voice, deep and gravelly, whispered his name. Jonah. He turned, and there, in the corner of the attic, was a figure. A tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. His heart stopped. It was Cropsey. The figure stepped forward, its long fingers reaching out toward him. You should never have come back. Jonah stumbled backward, his mind reeling with the truth. The deal his father had made had never ended. It had only been passed down, and now Jonah was the one who would pay the price. He could feel the weight of his family's sins pressing down on him, dragging him into the darkness. As the figure approached, Jonah realized there was no escaping it. The curse of Cropsey had always been tied to his family, and now it was his turn to face the consequences. The last thing Jonah saw before the darkness closed in around him was his sister's face, smiling, twisted, and empty. Just like the stories. Just like the nightmare that had haunted him all his life. Story number 9. The Lost Ones. The ruins of the old mental institution stood on the outskirts of town, decaying and forgotten. Once a place of suffering and dark secrets, it had been abandoned for decades, left to rot in the overgrown woods. But for a group of urban explorers, Jason, Ava, Ben, and Lily, it was the perfect place for an adventure. They had heard the stories. Everyone knew the tales of Cropsey, the boogeyman who was said to have lived in the institution, a monster who took children from the nearby town and left nothing but terror in his wake. They were just stories, though, passed down from generation to generation. Jason, the leader of the group, didn't believe in ghosts or legends. He believed in experiences, in the thrill of exploring places forgotten by time. The group arrived late in the afternoon, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows over the crumbling building. The place was huge, several stories tall, its windows shattered, and its walls covered in graffiti. The doors were rusted shut, but after a few minutes of prying, they found a gap big enough to squeeze through. They slipped inside, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. "Let's find something good," Jason said, already snapping photos with his camera. Ava was next to him, her flashlight illuminating the dark corners of the hall. She held a journal, scribbling notes about the place. Ben and Lily, quieter than the rest, stayed close by, keeping an eye on their surroundings. The floors creaked under their weight as they moved deeper into the building. The hall's empty except for debris and forgotten remnants of the past. But the deeper they went, the more they started to feel it. Something wasn't right. The air grew heavier, colder, and every time they turned a corner it felt like someone, or something, was watching them. Ava laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. "Cropsey's not real," she muttered, but even her voice seemed to tremble. They continued on, ignoring the growing unease. It wasn't until they reached the basement that things began to change. The basement was vast, with long, narrow hallways that seemed to stretch forever. It was pitch black, the only light coming from their flashlights. As they ventured deeper, they started finding strange things: old medical equipment, rusted chains, and handwritten notes pinned to the walls, some in ink, some in blood. The air felt thick here, oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in. "Okay, this is creepy," Lily whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Let's head back." But Jason, always the thrill-seeker, pushed forward. "No way. We're here now. We're going to find something worth it." They came across a room at the far end of the basement, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges that looked too fresh to be from animals or years of neglect. On the floor were old cracked cages, some open, some still locked shut. "Jesus," Ben breathed, stepping back. This place wasn't just a hospital, this was a prison. They heard something then, a scraping sound, like nails on stone. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, a scraping that turned into a dragging sound, slow and deliberate. Ava froze, the light from her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Did you hear that?" Jason turned, trying to shake off the growing panic. "It's probably just rats," he said, but even his voice lacked confidence now. They started to move toward the exit, but the noise grew closer. The dragging sound was unmistakable now. Something, or someone, was moving in the darkness. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died. Ava screamed, and Ben cursed, fumbling with the light. In that moment, the air grew colder, and the darkness around them seemed to pulse with a strange, malevolent energy. It was as if the building itself was alive, breathing, waiting for them. Then they heard it, a low, guttural growl that came from the shadows. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything they had ever heard before. The dragging sound stopped, replaced by something worse, the sound of something heavy, shuffling toward them. They turned to run, but the door slammed shut. Jason tried to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. Ben turned, his face pale with terror. "We have to get out of here, now!" But before they could react, a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, hunched, with dark, empty eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. Its mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin, filled with jagged teeth. It was wearing tattered clothes, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Cropsey. The legend was real. The creature stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it had been waiting for them. The group backed away, panic setting in as the walls seemed to close in around them. Jason grabbed Ava's arm, pulling her toward the window at the far end of the room. "We have to go, now!" But Cropsey was too fast. It lunged at them, its claws raking through the air. They scrambled to the window, but before they could reach it, the floor beneath them cracked, and they fell into the darkness below. Jason woke up to the sound of his own gasping breaths. He was alone, lying in a room he didn't recognize. The walls were covered in deep scratches. The smell of decay and mildew filled the air. He looked around, but there was no sign of his friends, no sign of Cropsey. He stumbled to his feet, his mind racing. He had to find them. He had to get out. But then he heard it again, the dragging sound, slow and deliberate. It was coming for him, and he realized, with a sinking feeling in his chest, that some places, some legends, should never be disturbed. Some places should stay untouched. The mental institution and everything tied to it had never been abandoned. It had always been alive, waiting for the next group of lost souls to wander in. And Cropsey, he was still here, still hungry, and still watching. Jason's breath caught in his throat as the shadows shifted around him. And then he heard his friends' screams, distant and echoing through the halls, as the darkness closed in. Story number 10. The Haunting of Cropsey Road. Dan had lived in the town his whole life. He knew every street, every corner, every creaky house on the block. Cropsey Road, however, was a place he'd always avoided. As a kid, the stories about the road were like campfire tales, told in hushed voices by older kids to scare the younger ones. They spoke of Cropsey, a figure who was said to haunt the road, appearing on the night of the full moon. They said he was a monster, someone who had lived in the woods behind the road, taking children to his lair. And every full moon, his shadow would stretch across the road, waiting for another victim. Dan had heard the stories. Everyone had. But as he grew older, he dismissed them as nonsense. A bunch of old myths meant to keep kids in line. But lately, something had been gnawing at him, a curiosity that he couldn't shake. It wasn't just the stories that had lingered in the town, it was the road itself. Cropsey Road had always been quiet, isolated, and a little wrong. The place was forgotten, hardly ever traveled, and Dan felt a strange pull to it now, as if something about it was calling him. That night, on the night of the full moon, he decided he was going to see for himself. No more avoiding the road. He would drive down it just once to prove there was nothing to fear. The sky was clear, the moon hanging high, casting an eerie glow over the landscape as Dan's car rumbled down the road. The air felt colder than it should have, the trees lining the road stretching out like dark, skeletal arms. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the road itself seemed to narrow, as if trying to swallow him whole. As he drove, a sense of unease settled over him. The stories about Cropsey played in his mind, but he laughed them off. There was no monster out here, there was nothing but trees and dirt, nothing but the quiet of the night. But as he neared the old bridge halfway down the road, something changed. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. The bridge was old, falling apart at the edges, the wood creaking under the weight of time. Dan slowed the car as he crossed it, his headlights flickering in the distance. That's when he saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the road. At first, Dan thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a tree stump or some animal. But as he got closer, the figure became clearer. A man, or something like a man, with twisted, sharp features, a long, dark coat that billowed in the wind. And his eyes, they weren't normal eyes, they were black, hollow, and they seemed to reach into Dan's soul, pulling him in. Dan slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at him, waiting. For a moment, Dan froze, unsure of what to do. He should turn around, leave, get out of there. But his curiosity, his foolish curiosity, kept him in place. The figure finally spoke, its voice low, almost a whisper, carried on the wind. "You should leave before it's too late." Dan's blood ran cold. He didn't know what to say, but the words were already out of his mouth before he could stop them. "I'm not scared of you," he said, his voice trembling, despite his bravado. The figure's grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, as if its mouth was too large for its face. "You don't understand," it said. "This road, it's mine. It always has been." Dan felt something shift in the air, a terrible weight pressing down on him. The trees seemed to bend toward him, and the road ahead looked darker, endless. And that's when he realized he wasn't alone. The road, the trees, the very ground beneath him, it was full of eyes. Eyes that weren't human. Eyes that had seen things Dan couldn't even begin to imagine. Suddenly, the road wasn't just a road anymore. It was something alive, something cursed, and it was pulling him in. He couldn't drive forward, couldn't turn around. The car wouldn't move. It was like the road itself had a grip on him, tightening around him, suffocating him. The darkness around him deepened. He heard the whispers then, low voices, echoing, like the wind had picked up the words of long-dead children. Whispers of pain, whispers of suffering. And then they became louder, clearer. "We were taken. We are still here. We're waiting." Dan's eyes darted around, trying to see where the voices were coming from. The trees, the shadows. The air itself seemed to pulse with the sound. And that's when he saw them. Figures moving in the darkness. Small, thin shapes with hollow eyes and pale skin, their faces twisted in agony. The children. The ones Cropsey had taken. They were all around him, watching him, reaching for him. They were trapped in the road, their souls bound to it forever, cursed to never leave. He tried to scream, but no sound came. He tried to move, to escape, but the road held him, the weight of it too much to bear. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the figure, the man, Cropsey. His grin stretched wider, his hollow eyes never leaving Dan's. "You're one of us now," Cropsey whispered, his voice all around him. And with that, Dan was lost. Forever. The next morning, the road was empty again, the sun rising over the horizon, casting light on the long stretch of dirt. But the curse of Cropsey Road was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. Because once you step onto Cropsey Road, you never leave. You become one of the lost ones, trapped in the darkness, cursed to roam the road forever. And the legend? It's real. It's always been real.